And so with that, bodhicitta, in our minds or hearts, we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened into the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see everybody. And we return to our text. For those who are following along, we're on page 30. But in brief, right, we're in the section on the, so we're covering mind and mental factors, and we're on the, we covered the 5 omnipresent mental factors, and now we're covering, we're kind of well into the section on the 5 object ascertaining mental factors. And we started the 4th of the 5, which was, this translator translates it as meditative concentration, but like I said last time, I think in this context, it's better, more accurate to call it concentration, which is what Geshe Rabten in his book, the translator uses. So I would say concentration. And then meditate, and then the concentration that comes in meditation would be one version of concentration. Okay, so we covered that, so we covered the definition of it, right? One point, I'll just go back to that because that's the key, or a key point. So it said, it is a one-pointedness of mind with respect to an imputed thing. It has the function of acting as a support for knowledge. Right? So it's the capacity or the function of staying one-pointedly on a certain thing, right? And it makes this point that by one-pointedly focusing on a thing, you gain knowledge or intelligence about that thing. And that was why I was saying the one-pointedness of mind, right? Like obviously when you're in meditative concentration, it's samadhi in Sanskrit, this tenzin, right? It's samadhi in Sanskrit. And in meditative concentration, of course, you are focusing on what you're, if you're cultivating, for example, calm abiding in meditation, then you're focusing one-pointedly. We made the point last time, that it's not just in meditation, because you could take the example of like a student, right, in school who's focusing single-pointedly on a certain question or a certain topic. That would be an example of that. Or somebody who's doing even a task, right, a complex task, and is really focused in that moment. They are focused one-pointedly, and it does function as support for knowledge, right, for understanding. So, so it could be in meditation or not in meditation. But then Geshe Gyaltsen focuses the text on meditation. So last time we covered different objects of meditation when you're cultivating calm abiding, right? And so we covered that, so I won't cover it again. But then he says, so I'm going to pick up in the middle of page 30. He raises, many Tibetan texts do this. If you read like Tibetan scholarly texts, right, they raise qualms. Like, so they'll sort of have somebody ask, actually, if you notice, even like Chandrakirti's text and great, all the way back to the great Indian treatises, Shantideva does it quite a bit too in the Guides of the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, right? They'll sort of raise a qualm or a question or a concern or a disagreement that somebody might raise in order to then answer that. So here he does that. He says, well then, does meditative concentration definitely have to be, does the object rather of meditative concentration definitely have to be a real object? Right, so he's saying what you're focusing on in your meditation, does it have to be real? Does it have to be something that exists? And the response, no. Whether the object be real or erroneous, if one attentively familiarizes oneself with it internally over and over again, clear appearance and non-conceptuality with respect to that object will arise. It is just as has been said in Dharmakirti's commentary on Dignagya's compendium on valid cognition. That's the problem of Arctic. It says there. Therefore, utmost familiarization with whatever, whether real or unreal, results in a clear non-conceptual mind when that familiarization is thoroughly completed. So pause here, right? So when you're what they're saying, right? If you contemplate this for a moment, is that when you're concentrating on something, right? They're saying, does what you're concentrating on have to actually exist? And actually, you can see both in examples from meditation and also just from non-meditation, where some people are single-pointedly focusing. Of course, that doesn't have to exist. First, I'll give an example of in meditation. There's a common, when meditating on impermanence, right? There's one technique that you could say taught by the Buddha, where a yogi, a person who's meditating, that now impermanence exists, right? That's an existent. But there is a meditative technique that's often mentioned where you visualize like the whole earth covered in skeletons, right? And it's a technique to remind us of impermanence. And they often cite that as an example. If a person who's meditating visualizes skeletons everywhere, there's a function to that. There's a purpose to that. But is it existent? No, right? There are literally skeletons laying around everywhere. So that could be an object of meditation, but it's not focusing on an existent. Actually, another example that one time Jimmy Kinsler mentioned this, like if you visualize, actually, if you're practicing Tantra, Vajrayana, right? And you visualize yourself as a deity, say you visualize yourself as Green Tara. Right? Well, actually, Kinsler one time said that, he said, well, are you Green Tara? No. Like Green Tara is a Buddha, you're a sentient being who's suffering. You're not, so you're actually meditating in that case again on an object that's not actually even conventionally existent, right? But he pointed out it serves a great function in both of those cases, right? If you're meditating on if you're trying to understand impermanence, it's a technique, right? The visualizing the corpses of the skeletons. Also, if you're practicing Vajrayana, it's a technique to visualize yourself as a certain deity, right? It has a skillful means to speed your path to enlightenment. But is it literally existent? Not yet, no. Right? So those are examples where the object of concentration, or in this case, meditative concentration, in those cases, would be a non-existent, right? But by the way, and the same thing could happen. In other words, a person could also cultivate concentration outside of meditation on non-existent things, right? People do it all the time, right? Where somebody's extremely focused on something, but it's a totally diluted idea, right? And they're analyzing it, like an example of that could be rumination, actually, which is terrible, right? Terrible waste of time when you ruminate, right? But when somebody ruminates, they're focusing single-pointedly on a non-existent thing, right? Like, actually, a very simplistic example would be if somebody's extremely worried about a future event that actually never happens, right? They could focus single-pointedly on a future non-existent future event. So that would be an example of concentration on an erroneous object, right? Have you ever done that? Right? Focus single-pointedly on non-existent, right? Also, when we're really angry at somebody, right? Have you ever done that? Where you get angry at somebody about something, then you realize they didn't even do what you think they did, but you're like so upset that they did something. It turns out they didn't even do it, but you can focus very strongly on that, right? That'd be an example of concentration on an erroneous object. So there are many. Unfortunately, there are countless examples of concentration on erroneous object. But then your object can also be an existent phenomenon, right? So if you're concentrating, an example would be the breath. Right? The breath is real, is conventionally existent, and you could focus on that. And there are countless also existent objects that you can focus on. So anyway, there are countless examples of both, and they're just making that point here that the object of your concentration could be something that exists or something that not exists. Then it says, the functional feature of meditative concentration is specified as acting as a support for knowledge. And I think it was Art translates that as, it was Geshe Rabtin's translate that as an increase of intelligence, right? So by the idea here is that when you concentrate, it increases your understanding, your intelligence, your knowledge. That's actually partly why actually, even conventionally, in sort of ordinary language, we know this in the sense that it's why in school, right, teachers will say, oh, you have to focus, you have to concentrate, right, if you want to learn the material. If you're not concentrating, you're not going to learn well. So it says, because through the force of analysis with the wisdom of individual investigation and dependence upon calm abiding, now he's getting into a more advanced version. So on a conventional everyday level, if you concentrate on something, your understanding of it improves. I'll just share it actually on that. I remember at one point like realizing that that's like this is a side point, but I just want to note this, that some of these people who are quite naturally intelligent don't actually, I've noticed this, don't learn to concentrate well. So actually they're not good learners sometimes, right? If things come too easily, then sometimes people don't learn that you have to concentrate on something over time to actually learn about it. And so sometimes it's like it's a fault of people who learn too easily as kids, don't learn how to focus and concentrate in order to increase their knowledge. And that's one of the gifts, I think, of Buddhist psychology, is they make this point that if you have natural intelligence, that's a result of your past karma, right? But then you need to concentrate in this life in order to increase your knowledge. So it's a point here that they're making about how do you increase your understanding, your wisdom, your intelligence. In general, you need to cultivate this mental factor of concentration, right? It increases our understanding and our intelligence and our learning and so on. Now here he's getting into a more advanced meditative version of that. So he says, the functional feature of meditative concentration, and in terms of acting as sport for knowledge, he says, because through the force of analysis with wisdom, now he's getting at a particular version of concentration and wisdom. He says, through the force of analysis with the wisdom of individual investigation in dependence upon calm abiding, in which the mind is internally set in equipoise, one achieves special insight observing the modes and varieties. So what's he getting at there? I'll just want to explain that, because I think the language isn't easily dawn in your mind necessarily. So there, what he's saying is, when you've cultivated the extremely powerful version of concentration, which is shamatha, right, or shine in Tibetan, calm abiding, right? So that's when one cultivates. Actually, let's start with, so I said this in the very beginning, that there are two different words that you sometimes hear from Sanskrit, right? One is samadhi, which is this concentration, right? And there's shamatha, which is calm abiding. So shamatha, or calm abiding, is a specific form of concentration that's quite advanced. And if you study, for example, in like the Lamrim or in the texts of Asanga, it describes like 9 levels of concentration that one goes through as one approaches calm abiding. So those are all different levels of concentration, and eventually you achieve this state of calm abiding. And in calm abiding, first of all, you can effortlessly stay single-pointedly focused on any one object that you choose. And you develop a kind of, they call it a bliss and appliancy, flexibility of mind and body, where you don't get tired, you don't get distracted, you don't get fatigued. And they say your mind is like and body also are very light and very flexible and very easy to focus on what you want. So what he's getting at here is, if you cultivate that kind of, he's talking about, so he says calm abiding, right? Independence upon calm abiding. So he's saying someone who has already cultivated, when you first are cultivating calm abiding, you stay with one object for a long time because you're trying to develop this deep concentration, and you develop with kind of clarity of mind. So you have this kind of clarity and intelligence and concentration. And what he's getting at here is, once you have that calm abiding, you can then use wisdom of individual investigation, right, to analyze things. And what they say, actually, if you read in the Lamrim, it describes this, how once you have calm abiding, when you start investigating, at first it disturbs your calm abiding a bit, right? Your calm abiding, you sort of lose a little bit of that calm abiding because you're analyzing, right? And then you go back to calm abiding, and then you analyze, and then you go back to calm abiding, and then you analyze. And eventually there's something called a union of calm abiding and special insight. And what that is there comes a point when by this process of staying, a person who already has calm abiding, then they analyze, right? It disturbs it a little and they go back. Again, they analyze. It disturbs it a little, they go back. And eventually they come to a point where their analysis itself induces calm abiding. And that's a unique thing. So the person can analyze something and the analysis itself causes their mind to kind of have an insight that penetrates, that stays single-pointedly on the object. And that's an extremely powerful kind of mind. And what he's saying here is that's called the union. First of all, that's called the union of calm abiding and special insight. And that mind is a goal of for Buddhist practice. In particular, when you have calm abiding, and then you can have this union of calm abiding and special insight, and when the object of your analysis is emptiness, right? Then that becomes a kind of deep realization of emptiness with special insight. And for those of you who are familiar with the 5 paths, right, that you traverse to enlightenment, when somebody achieves the union of calm abiding and special insight that's focused on emptiness, they achieve the path of preparation. That's the marking point of achieving the path of preparation. So that's a very powerful state in which you realize your object with incredible concentration. And that's what they mean when they talk about the wisdom arisen from meditation, they're talking about that's what they're talking about, right? There's the wisdom of listening, there's the wisdom of contemplating, right? And then there's the wisdom that arises from meditation. Really, when they talk about the wisdom arisen from meditation, they're talking about this union of calm abiding and special insight. And that when you have that, you have a special kind of wisdom that's much more powerful in how it impacts your experience. So that's a goal, and that really, when they talk about really increasing your knowledge, they're talking about that's a very profound version or level of that. So then he quotes Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. He says, having understood that the afflictions are destroyed by special insight that is fully endowed with calm abiding, first seek calm abiding that is achieved through taking joy in non-attachment to the world. And so what's he saying there? He's saying that how do you get rid of your mental afflictions, right? The ultimate solution to them is special insight, right, into the view. But he's saying, in order, actually, this is just true, and according to Buddhist teachings, that in order to achieve special insight, actually, I want to differentiate. You can have insight without calm abiding, right? We can all have insights. You can even have an insight into emptiness without calm abiding, right? You can realize emptiness conceptually. But to gain special insight into emptiness, that means you first have to have calm abiding, right? So Shantideva is saying, first seek calm abiding, right? Before you can, it's not possible to achieve special insight, because the definition of special insight is that it's a mind that, that has insight or realizes its object in union with calm abiding. And so first that person has to have calm abiding, then they cultivate a wisdom or an insight understanding it, and then they have a unification of those two. And through that, they have that's a powerful tool for actually eliminating the mental afflictions. And that eventually leads to a direct realization of emptiness. So that's the process of getting rid of the mental afflictions, is you first cultivate calm abiding, and you cultivate a union of calm abiding and special insight into the view of emptiness, and then eventually you achieve a direct realization of emptiness, and that's becomes the main antidote to the mental afflictions. So whether you're, whichever path to liberation or enlightenment you're following, whether it be the, individual liberation or a Mahayana, the great vehicle, or Vajrayana, they're all common in the sense that you have to have a union of calm abiding and special insight. Then it says, also the scripture on discipline repeatedly teaches the ways in which the training in meditative concentration depends upon the training in ethics, and the training in wisdom depends on the training in meditative concentration. In this manner, those wishing for liberation from their heart should regard these great texts as supreme quintessential instructions. So again, what's he saying in this last part here? He's saying that, we often talk about the three higher trainings, right? Training in ethics, or this, what do you say here? Ethics, yeah. The training in concentration and the training in wisdom. One point he's making is that those are like steps. That in other words, if you want to, you have to first cultivate ethics in order to develop effective concentration. And then it's the dependence upon concentration that you develop, deeper wisdom. So those three go together, but they also kind of are emphasized in a certain order, right? Because the one helps the next. And part, it's because like actually, if you're not, actually, we can even see that, you can see that in trying to develop calm abiding. They say you have to be extremely ethical, but even in our ordinary lives, right? If you're having a lot of what's the word? Drama in your life from our own, let's say, lack of ethical action, we're not going to be able to concentrate very well on our meditation. Right? So even on an everyday level, this is true. And then as you continue to progress, it becomes even more precise that one has to follow ethics in order to develop concentration. And then once concentration helps support wisdom. And in his last line here, it says, I just want to go over this last sentence again. He says, in this manner, those who wish for liberation from their hearts should regard these great texts as supreme quintessential instructions. And I just want to say something very brief about that. He said he'll say things like this numerous times throughout our text here, right? Where he's saying it's the great treatises of Buddhism that one should study if one really wants to progress. I was sort of thinking about that line, and he says this kind of thing numerous times because it's exactly what, if you listen to like the public and also Dharma teachings of His the Dalai Lama, almost every single time he says that, doesn't he? He says, like, if you want to progress on the path, study, how many times does Dalai Lama say, study the works of Chandrakirti, study the works of Nagarjuna, and so on, study the works of Shantideva. And I think I was thinking about like that we're all trying to do that together to some extent, right? Study these kind of texts. And then it's like at one point in here, it's funny, Yeshe Gyaltsen, who lived in a time and a place where there was much more Dharma study than our place and time, was saying it's rare for people to have an interest in that. And so I don't know, I was thinking like, whenever one does that, one should sort of feel good about that. It's quite a, if you're interested in Buddhism, Dalai Lama always says that, right? If you're interested in studying Buddhism, that to study these kinds of topics it's not easy, right? It takes effort, it takes deep thought, it takes a lot of reflection, but that there is value in it. And that he's saying here, then you study these kinds of topics, right? Because liberation doesn't come about. I was thinking about, like, it's easier, like it's a lot easier, there are like introductory talks or something, and they're much easier, aren't they? Actually, I'll say, as somebody who's also, attended but also taught for a long time, they're also easier to give, actually. It's easy to give an introductory talk and just say, like, you grasp it too much, like, if you grasp it, whatever, ice cream too much, then that's, that's like this, and then whatever, you grasp at your partner a lot, it's like that. And it's true, I mean, it's true, and those are valuable, but it's not, these are much more difficult topics. But if we want to progress on the path, it's saying, the Dalai Lama and Yeshe Gyaltsen are saying we have to study these topics to make if you want to go to a certain level of progress, right? It doesn't just happen like on its own, and it's like following the precise instructions of the Buddhas, right? That they're detailed, and they're precise because the process of interchange is precise and detailed. So anyway, I think he's encouraging us to keep up our efforts at our study and practice. So anyway, okay, he's being encouraging of that. But okay, well, that's the end of that little section on concentration. Any questions about the concentration section before we start the last of these 5, which is the wisdom section? No. Okay. Oh, Sujata.
Yeah, I just have a quick a vocabulary word. Shine is in Tibetan. Is that right?
Yeah, Shine is the Tibetan word for shamatha or kamava.
For shamatha. Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
And then, okay, so now the last of these 5 object ascertaining mental factors. Sherab in Tibetan. Our translator here translates this as wisdom. I was sort of looking, Art Engel translates it as wisdom. Geshe Rabden's translator translates it as intelligence. You can decide for yourself. I kind of, again, I personally kind of prefer intelligence, I think, with wisdom being one kind of, because you'll see, because part of the point here is that these can be virtuous or non-virtuous mental factors, right? So, and they'll give there'll be examples here. Geshe Gelsen mainly gives Buddhist examples, right? So he's talking, his examples mostly are wisdom. But technically, well, actually, I'll read the definition and then I'll explain why. It says here, regarding the entity of wisdom, the compendium of knowledge, right? The Abhidharma says, what is wisdom? The response: it strongly differentiates the qualities of things that are to be examined. It has the function of overcoming doubt. Right, and so that which differentiates the qualities of things by examining them and overcomes doubt. I just make one point. Wisdom does do that, but so does intelligence, right? And sometimes they'll give an example, like a person who makes a new weapon to kill people has this quality. So this is mainly when we talk about this quality, we're talking from a Buddhist perspective, which then it is wisdom. But I think intelligence gets at what they're actually getting at here. It's a kind of I don't know, that differentiates things, that that can overcome doubt and sort of see the quality. It says differentiates the qualities or the functions of things, right? Like, so it's not necessarily wisdom. I just think if you get it, the connotation of the English words, like, for example, a good scientist or a good inventor has this quality, but they're not necessarily wise in the way I would use the word wise. So I guess that's what I'm getting at. I'll use wisdom sometimes because it's in the text, but I think intelligence gets at the meaning, for me at least, better. Right, so it strongly differentiates the qualities of things to be examined. It has the function of overcoming doubt. And so one point I'll just make is I want to differentiate this for a moment from the mental factor, the all-pervasive mental factor of discrimination, right, from earlier, because this is different than discrimination. Remember, discrimination discriminates or sort of becomes aware of the uncommon feature of a thing, right? So discrimination discriminates like a person from, oh, that's a human versus a tree, for example. This one is different. It gets at the qualities of things. What's the word? It sees their good and bad traits or their functions or their capacities, and it overcomes doubt. Discrimination doesn't overcome doubt and doesn't differentiate the qualities and the functions of things, so they're different in that way. Geshe Rabden makes an interesting point in his text, which isn't mentioned here, so I'll just mention it briefly. He mentions that there's something said to be 4 kinds of intelligence. One is inborn. He uses intelligence, I'll use it there. One is an inborn intelligence, which is like you could say, what's the word? It's like nature versus nurture, right? It's our genetic or something. According to Buddhism, that comes from past lives. And so some people have a kind of natural intelligence when they're, or natural wisdom when they're born. That comes from having cultivated that quality in previous lifetimes. Then the other three are cultivated in this lifetime. One is the wisdom or intelligence that comes from study and learning. Another is the wisdom or intelligence that comes from contemplating, from analyzing, from thinking deeply. And then the third is the wisdom or intelligence that comes from meditation, right? And especially from the union of calm abiding and special insight that we just mentioned. So those are, he just makes the point, those are 4 different types of intelligence. And so, yeah, so anyway, and we can cultivate, we can cultivate those, of course. And one point that Buddhism makes, though, also is, actually, there are a lot of Buddhist stories like this, that suggest that, that natural inborn intelligence, while useful, can easily be overemphasized. I think sometimes in my history that I've seen that be overemphasized, where like the fact that somebody, when they're a child, or it has a natural intelligence. Actually, if you watch this, it's actually true, isn't it? Like, what they're getting at in Buddhism is that there are many stories of like people who seem to be extremely unintelligent at first, who then do practice and study, or do Manjushri practice and then do their studies well, who become great scholars and great practitioners. And there are also many stories of people who are naturally intelligent who don't really amount to much. So having natural intelligence that comes from previous lives, while useful, shouldn't be overemphasized. The idea at one point in Buddhism is that these mental factors can be cultivated, right? So the idea is that just because somebody doesn't have a great deal of natural wisdom or intelligence doesn't mean they can't cultivate it. And you cultivate it by study, by concentrating, right? By contemplating, by meditating, and so on, and your wisdom can increase greatly. And there are stories even from the time of the Buddha. You probably know that story, right? Where there was the guy where he couldn't memorize even like one line. Like, he came to the monastery, and there was the time of the Buddha, right? And others were trying to teach him, and like they would teach him, like he would like forget the end of the line by the time he remembered the beginning of it, and they thought he was hopeless, right? And then the Buddha asked him to sweep, right? And he said something like, just say, as you're sweeping, just say, I'm cleaning the dirt, I'm cleaning the stains, and just clean, And the guy followed the Buddha's advice. And at a certain point, he realized that the dirt were the mental afflictions. That when the Buddha said, I'm cleaning the dirt, the Buddha must have meant the mental afflictions. And then when he said, I'm cleaning the stains, he must have meant the imprints of the mental afflictions. Right? And then he contemplated what the Buddha must have meant. He realized, how do you clean those? Well, it's not with a broom. The broom symbolizes the wisdom, understanding selflessness. Right? And then he kept doing that. And eventually he realized selflessness. And then he developed calm abiding and special insight and became an arhat. So he became, like through those 2 lines from the Buddha, he eventually became, fully, not fully enlightened, but an arhat, a liberated being of great intelligence. So it's a story that many Buddhist stories are like that suggests that this mental factor of wisdom can be cultivated. And there are a lot of Tibetan stories that are similar like that. But okay, so now Geshe Gelsen goes on. Just as it has been said above, wisdom is a knower that individually differentiates the faults and good qualities of things that are to be examined. Right, so now he's getting into more detail, the qualities, the faults, the good qualities, and well, I'll just keep going. Objects that are to be examined by wisdom are of 3 types: virtuous, non-virtuous, and unspecified. Wisdom individually differentiates the faults and good qualities of those. And so again, I just want to remind everybody that this mental factor, when it's analyzing, for example, the view of emptiness, is virtuous, right? When it's analyzing karma, it's a virtuous, right? If you're analyzing karma to understand it correctly, that'd be virtuous, and so on. There are many things you can do, but this is not intrinsically virtuous. So you're analyzing virtuous, non-virtuous, and unspecified objects for their good and bad qualities. So if you were, so if somebody's doing that, somebody could be using their intelligence out of anger, right, to figure out the function of things in order to hurt somebody. That wouldn't be virtuous, right? So again, I just want to point that out, that this mental factor can be virtuous or non-virtuous depending upon the intention behind it. Yeah, and actually an unspecified, like examining the unspecified could be like, that could be like, I mean, that would actually be something like where you're examining the object is unspecified, right? Meaning neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. I just want to give an example, like, in other words, that's what I was getting at, like a scientist or a inventor, right? Who's analyzing the functions and the qualities of a certain, say, mechanism or of a certain element in order to do something with it. That would be, the element itself is not virtuous or unvirtuous. And you know, if they're just doing it out of curiosity, that's not virtuous or non-virtuous either, actually, right? You know, and then and then it depends on your intention. You know, if it could be an unspecified, it could be a virtuous intention or a non-virtuous intention. But you're still, if you're analyzing the faults and good qualities and the functions of something, that would be this kind of intelligence, I would call it. But again, that I wouldn't call that wisdom exactly. But Lynn has a comment or a question.
The part I don't understand is that doubt disappears, and this is a real life example. There were a number of Italians that came over during World War II and developed the atomic bomb, Los Alamos. And one of them that came over with Fermi, Bruno Rossi, they were very tortured because they had all worked together with Eisenberg, and Eisenberg worked for the Nazis. And so while they were developing the bomb, they did it because they were part of the war effort against the Nazis. But they were conflicted about it because they knew the terrible destruction. And they obviously, as scientists, lost control over that. The political people took control. But this particular scientist, Rossi, he was tortured till he died about whether that was the right thing to do. And he was brilliant, a brilliant scientist. He had a lot of natural. And he also acquired a lot during his lifetime. And he was also very thoughtful. I don't know if he meditated, but he was a very thoughtful person. And he never did defense work after that. He only did, he ended up in solar physics. But that doubt never went away. And I don't know how, with historical events like that, how it would ever go away, because we don't have complete knowledge.
I think it's a great question. I want to use it. I think you're getting at some of the details of this. I want to actually, I'll share my own thought about it, at least, of what this teaching would be getting at. Is like, so, you know, so he was somebody with an inborn natural intelligence, right? And in terms of this mental factor of, I'm going to call it intelligence for now, right? That strongly differentiates the qualities, the functions, the faults and good qualities of a certain thing. What I would suggest is that when he would, let's say, I don't know the exact detail of, you know, his days or something like that, but, you know, when the object of his concentration was, say, when he was at work one day, right, and the object of his focus or his ascertainment, or the object of his main mind, you could say, right, when he was focusing, so the object of his awareness in a given moment was, say, the atom or a certain mechanism in the scientific, you know, in the development of the bomb. In that moment, he could overcome doubt. He'd go, oh, this will work like this. Oh, if we put this part, you know, if we make this part in this way, that will work. So in other words, when he applied his intelligence to a certain mechanism or a certain detail or a certain aspect of the procedure of how to build an object, in that case, a bomb, his intelligence was able to overcome a doubt. Like he could say, oh, this would work, or this won't work, or, oh, that's a problem, like this will be a problem. Like, as a person can analyze a certain object, and if they're good at it, they can recognize, oh, this won't work, but that might, for example, try that. There, one is gradually through, and if you think of the scientific method, one gradually overcomes a certain kind of doubt, right? One comes to say, oh, this can work, but this can't, or this can function this way, but
but then there's the ethical element.
that's a different thing. That's what I'm getting. In terms of, in one moment when he's analyzing an object, he can overcome the doubt through the wisdom. The other, then it's a different object, right? Now he's no longer focusing on a trigger mechanism or whatever it would be. I don't know, whatever that would be. Now he's focusing on a different question, which is, was that ethically correct to do? And what's interesting then, if he never overcame the doubt, one would say he had wisdom with regards to the physical object, right? But he didn't have, or he had intelligence, but his intelligence with regard to ethical questions wasn't strong, actually. He wasn't able to overcome the doubt. And that if the function here is to overcome doubt, so my point is like, you can have wisdom understanding one thing, but not another, right? And one of the critiques, I think, of certain kinds of, actually, that's, if you think of it from this perspective, this is why I personally think it's important, why I like to differentiate between intelligence and wisdom, is there are a lot of examples, isn't it, where like researchers, for example, have intelligence that can understand the function of things, but don't have the wisdom to understand ethical implications of things. And so I think it's two different objects. So if a person cultivates, actually, you can see a lot of that.
But it also gets into the control you have over things. And this happened with the geneticists. There were a bunch of Italian geneticists who had the same problem. Do we clone? Do we get into genetic engineering? Because it can be used for very bad purposes. And the political actors are going to have control over the science. We aren't. So the question is, do you do it? Do you do that research that can't be controlled, that you can't control? Yeah,
and I think you're getting it. So do you see the point there, though, that like it's two different objects? In other words, that this kind of intelligence, you have to really be careful to say that, one is understanding, like, in other words, there's a wisdom that can understand the function and the sort of the actual, let's say, genetic code, right? Then there's another kind of object of analysis, because there's wisdom differentiates and analyzes, right? There's another object of analysis, which is an ethical question. And so the question I would raise is like, does one have, so I guess, like, say this right. According to, actually, maybe I'll say it this way. What Buddhism is suggesting is that wisdom, I'm going to call it now wisdom, because this is what I would call wisdom personally. Wisdom understanding these ethical questions is much more important than wisdom understanding the physical questions. And one point that I would say that Buddhism is emphasizing here, and that Buddhism always emphasizes, is that there are many kinds of intelligence, I'll call it, right? And what Buddhism is saying is what matters for human beings is getting good at the wisdom understanding ethical questions. And that's what matters, actually, for the well-being of yourself and others. And that oftentimes we make the mistake of overemphasizing, I'll call it, intelligence regarding the physical without enough cultivation of this kind of wisdom understanding ethical questions. And what Buddhism would say is, like, what Buddhism does say is, it's that wisdom understanding the ethical that is the basis of well-being, is the basis of happiness and suffering, is the basis of harm to oneself and others, or benefit to oneself and others. So that's much, much more important according to Buddhism, because, you know, I mean, yeah, anyway, for obvious reasons, I don't need to say why, you know why, but so that's what I would say is that, you know, so a lot of times what happens, if you think about your question, is that people grow up in a culture that doesn't teach them to differentiate. Like, that doesn't teach them how to develop moral wisdom, wisdom about ethical questions, I'll call it, maybe is a better way to put that, and only teaches them wisdom or intelligence about the physical or the political, for example. You know, a person could have wisdom or intelligence about political gamesmanship, but not about ethical things. A person could have wisdom about, you know, research and not about ethical things. And what Buddhism is saying is that is the wisdom understanding the ethical that matters, actually. So I think that's the issue there, is that, you know, so we can cultivate, that's what I mean, we can cultivate the wrong kind of, or a not helpful kind of intelligence, if we don't cultivate the intelligence or wisdom of ethical, moral, compassion, you know, questions of human compassion, questions of ethics, really. Yeah. Oh, first Sujata first, and then Damja. See, the order of the hands up.
I think where I really appreciate this distinction you're making about that. My gut tells me that the word in English, wisdom, does relate more to like something that implies like knowledge about what's actually virtuous, what are virtuous activities, and the ethical piece of things. I think that where I'm getting tripped up too is at the time that I hear the word wisdom most, the wisdom realizing emptiness, I think is where, like, because that's also a term that we hear a lot of the time. And I'm curious if you would call that intelligence realizing, like in the way you're thinking about the two words, would you put that more in the intelligence realizing emptiness, or would you still use the word wisdom for wisdom realizing emptiness?
I personally would use the word wisdom, but I think one way I would almost do, for me personally, the way I think of it, and I'm just, this is like my own idiosyncratic way to think of it, is kind of similar to the previous one. Like where I said like concentration, you know, I prefer the word concentration to meditative concentration for Tenzin, you know, for samadhi, but then meditative concentration would be a subset. So from my perspective, I would call all of these intelligence, you know, and then wisdom is I would call wisdom a subset of intelligence. So I would say that, you know, like for me personally, I would say like somebody who's realizing emptiness has both an intelligence, but a subset of like, the kind of intelligence that would be wisdom realizing it. That's the way I personally think of it, is like when somebody's realizing emptiness, it's clearly an intelligence, but it's also a wisdom from my perspective. But that's not, you know, I'm just trying to capture English words that these Tibetan words don't quite correlate to perfectly. So it's you know, we have to kind of, you can use your own words, but that's how I think of it anyway. Is that so wisdom is a subset? Yeah.
So it seems like wisdom then to your mind is more about things ethical and then understanding the ultimate nature of reality. Like, I don't know, it's like the important stuff, and then everything else is stuff that we're puzzling out with our intelligence. But that those sort of two buckets, right? Like the ultimate nature of reality, and things are virtuous. We're trying to understand the ultimate nature of reality is also virtuous, I guess. I don't know. It's just interesting about this, versus like all the other stuff that we're trying to figure out, like how it works. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and one of the quick point really to what Sujata said, I'll just note, is if you look at what we'll continue on in Yeshe Gelsen's text in this, but it's really interesting that, like, I mean, because Yeshe Gelsen is Yeshe Gelsen, right? A Buddhist monk and a teacher of one of the Dalai Lamas and so on. That it's very, you can get this sense of a cultural difference that, excuse me, he barely mentions. He just, I mean, he says the unspecified there. He has that word, and non-virtuous, and that's all he says of that. And then he goes on to talk about mostly virtuous, you know, and most Buddhist texts do that because they're, you know, I mean, if you think of some of these texts are written by, you know, or Vasubandhu's text is similar, because these are Buddhist monks who spend their entire lives focusing on the cultivation of wisdom, right? And so I think it's funny. I also think, you know, for me, part of this question comes from having grown up in a very different context and lived in a very different context where I've, you know, like I say, actually, it's funny. I didn't think of it that way. Like much of my life has been spent around people who are non-virtuously intelligent. You know, and so I live in a very different context than Yeshe Geltsen or Vasubandhu. And so that, you know, so I think for me, that question becomes more prominent, you know, or Lynn, who's, you know, been reading about, you know, scientists, you know, from Italy who did, you know, we have an embeddedness in a different kind of culture that has emphasized intelligence in a different way than Yeshe Geltsen's culture did. So I think for me anyway, I ask a different question than him sometimes. So I think actually, you know, in that way, Yeshe Geltsen's concern is actually wisdom, because his life was dedicated to wisdom. Anyway, I just think that's just a reflection, but Damchu.
Yeah, before I ask the question, I just want to make a comment. I heard a talk by Jeffrey Hopkins one time, and he said that the Dalai Lama had spoken at Columbia University to a lot of academics, obviously, and scientists and so forth. And he said that in India, they used to have, you know, academic subjects at universities, but they also taught compassion. And he suggested that they revise their curriculum. And he said that Jeffrey Hopkins said all the audience were like, yeah, that's great. But he said it never changed. So I just wanted to share that with you, because there was a different emphasis in, you know, the universities in the past in India, where they did combine these moral, you know, principles in their academic studies. They were conjoined. So anyway, I wanted to just ask a question with respect to innate intelligence. Would they include genetics in that? For example, you know, often we would say someone's intelligent because both their parents were, in the genetics of, would that be part of innate intelligence?
Yes, I think that, look, actually one commentary I read was saying that you know, somebody asked that in one of the commentaries I was reading, modern commentary, and the answer was like that would be the person's that the person's karma would be if you were born in a certain body that had certain genetic predispositions or certain, you know, kind of brain functions or some, you know, brain structures, but that would be, you know, that the person's karma from previous lives would predispose them to to be born in one body versus another kind of body, you know, or to one, you know, with one combination of genetic material versus another. So the idea is that those would be interdependent. Would be the view, I think, of Buddhism.
Thank you.
Continue on here. So it says, then it says there are 4 ways of reasoning for differentiating faults and good qualities. Oh, and so here he's giving it a standard. This is like a standard sort of set of 4 ways of reasoning. So first is, I'll just go through them briefly. One is functional reasoning, that examines the functions or abilities of phenomena, right? Yeah, so the functions or the abilities, the capacities, you could say, of phenomena, right? We were giving examples earlier. Sometimes it could be, actually, it's funny when I say that, the function, meaning actually, I'll just ask you this. Like when I read that, functional reasoning examines the functions, abilities, or capacities of phenomena. I have a question for you. Do you immediately think of physical phenomena or mental phenomena when I say that? For you personally? And all I want to point out is, Yeshe Geltsen, I didn't know him, obviously, he's master of the past, but the point is a Buddhist, like somebody who's embedded in the context of Buddhist practice would think first mostly of mental phenomena. And they would say, and then if you said, well, doesn't it also analyze the function of physical, the functional reasoning of related to physical phenomena? They would say, oh yeah, that too. Which do you think of first? Is just a question I would raise. But functional reasoning, right, examines the functions. So there is the first, because why? Because the moral questions are ethical questions, Dharma practice questions are, what's the function of anger, right? What's the function of jealousy? What's the function of pride? Right? Those are ethical questions. Those are practice questions. Then they would say, oh, it also examines the functions of fire or of water or of, whatever, copper, of elements. In other words, yes, it would also reason about those things, right? But the more important questions would be the functions of mental phenomena, because those relate more fundamentally to the well-being of yourself and others. So, but that's function. Next one is the reasoning of dependence. This examines causes and results of phenomena, right? So what gives rise to what? What depend, this arises in dependence upon that. This can serve as the cause of that. This would be a result of that. So it's reasoning that analyzes those kinds of, and again, right, that would be in inner questions, like karmic questions, and also outer, right? So they could say a seed, right? A seed is, a sprout arises and depends upon a seed. But also, right, like the 12 links of dependent origination, right, would be an example of the reasoning of dependence. And if you look in, Buddhist practice, which is more emphasized, right, the 12 links of dependent origination are a core teaching. Right? That would be a meditation or an analysis, a way of reasoning. Focusing on dependence would be looking at the 12 links of dependent origination, and they go through them in the forward order and the reverse order and so on, right? Analyzing dependence. Next one is logical reasoning. That is reasoning using syllogisms, right? So proof statements, and there are a whole Buddhist teaching on the nature of a proof statement, different ways of creating proof statements. But logical reasoning is reasoning, in dependence upon proof statements or syllogisms. The most common example, not the most common, but a very common one in Buddhist sort of that they use as an example is, sound is impermanent because it's a product, right? So you have to say, well, are all products by nature impermanent? And are all, you could ask all different questions about it. Are all impermanent things products? Are all products impermanent? So that, you would analyze that to see, is the reasoning correct? And then the last one is reasoning of nature, and that examines the nature of things. For example, that water flows down naturally in its natural state, or that fire flares up, and so on. Analyzing the natural properties, you could say, of things. That could also include, like, does something conduct electricity or not, and so on. So the nature of certain phenomena. Actually, it's what Ben Franklin was doing, right, when he was out the kite or something. He was trying to analyze the nature of things, of lightning in that case. So those are 4 ways of reasoning to analyze the faults, the good qualities, the functions, the capacities, and so on of phenomena. And again, you see the point here that we can cultivate this kind of intelligence or wisdom through effort. Then it says, when one gains certainty through analysis with these 4 types of reasoning, doubt will be overcome. And so there he's talking about, right, this, and so doubt is we'll get into it later, it's one of the mental factors, but doubt is a 2-pointed mind, right? And what they're getting at is when you're 2-pointed about something, actually, there, just point something out here that has an implication. I'll read the sentence again. When one gains certainty through analysis with these 4 types of reasoning, doubt will be overcome. I actually want to go back to Lynn's example of the scientist who spent his life in a state of doubt. I just think that, one thing I think I've thought about a lot is that, like, there are many examples like that of people who remain in a state of doubt for years and years, right, about different things. And what this text is saying, but also what Buddhism says, is I'm going to say there is that actually that we shouldn't stay in a state of doubt, right? Buddhism saying use reasoning and overcome your doubt. So, like, I think there's a quality. I've often thought that, like, actually somebody else pointed this out once. If you, like, there's that famous Rodin statue, the thinker, right, where he's like this, and he's sort of, and somebody pointed out they contrasted that with the statue of the Buddha, right, who's sitting up straight and sort of, and I could take that almost as a metaphor. Well, I'm taking that in this moment as a metaphor. The thinker looks like he's in a state of doubt. He's not sure. He's contemplating kind of in a state like this. And what Buddhism is saying here in this text even is, well, doubt should be overcome. Like if you're a thinker, don't sit around wasting decades in doubt. Analyze it and overcome your doubt through reasoning. And so I guess I would just challenge myself ultimately, right? Like, so Buddhism actually would, to some extent, would say if you stay in a state of doubt, in one way, doubt can be a good thing. It's better than being certain about being wrong and being certain. Having doubt is much better than being wrong and certain in your wrongness. Being certain of something that's wrong. So in that way, doubt could be a good thing. But also, Buddhism is. This is my own argument for a second. So I don't know if Buddhism is exactly saying this, but I sometimes take Buddhism to mean to stay in doubt for too long is a kind of intellectual laziness. Buddhism saying apply the 4 types of reasoning, figure it out, overcome your doubt through analysis and I'll continue on because I think it further elaborates on that. It says, hence, its functional feature, right? Intelligence or wisdom's functional feature is specified as overcoming doubt. With these meanings in mind, the foremost omniscient Tsongkhapa says in his beginning and end, he says, having properly examined day and night the meaning of what has been heard with the 4 types of reasoning, may I eradicate doubt with analytical awareness that arises from contemplating the objects that are to be contemplated. Right. So what Tsongkhapa is saying there is what I think is similar to what I was just saying, which is analyze deeply, right? Like there was actually Tsongkhapa himself had doubts about emptiness, right? He had studied emptiness with the greatest teachers existing in his time in Tibet. But he said, like, if you look in his biography, right, like Tupten Jimpa wrote a beautiful biography of Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa was like, he's not satisfied with doubt, right? In other words, you shouldn't be satisfied. That's what he's saying here. Don't be satisfied with doubt. Ask deeper, study more, contemplate more deeply, read more deeply, dream more deeply, do everything. In other words, give your whole self over to the process of cultivating wisdom. And in that way, you can overcome your doubts, right? And when you see emptiness directly, there's no more doubt. His Tsongkhapa's biography. But he's saying that here, right? May I eradicate doubt with analytical awareness, and especially about the things that matter most. Tsongkhapa is therefore saying, right, you should be able to overcome your doubts. Yeah, and and I guess I would argue, like, it doesn't mean you can overcome your doubts about everything, right? Like what's happening and how many planets are there and the other, whatever, around a certain star that we can't, that we don't yet have telescopes to see accurately or something. Well, that maybe you can't overcome doubts about very easily. As a Buddha, I guess you could. But what Tsongkhapa is saying is about things that matter, it's possible to overcome your doubts. About the things that matter for your own liberation and for your being of benefit to others, those are doubts that can be overcome. So overcome them. And how do you overcome them? He says, day and night, right? Apply the 4 types of reasoning. And then he says that arise from contemplating the objects that are to be contemplated. And again, I think this is getting back to Lynn's point, right? Lynn's question, rather. Tsongkhapa is saying, contemplating the objects that are to be contemplated. What are the objects, according to Tsongkhapa, what are the objects to be contemplated, right? They're questions of the path. They're questions of, what is one to do with one's precious human rebirth, right? What's the nature of reality? What's good and what's bad to do with your life, right? Today and tomorrow. These are questions Tsongkhapa is saying are, what's the word? Objects to be contemplated. And he's saying if you contemplate those with the 4 types of reasoning, you can overcome your doubt with wisdom. And when you overcome your doubt with wisdom, then you can live wisely. That would be, I think, the implication of what Tsongkhapa is saying there. And I'll just elaborate a little more on that. I wrote down a few points from I went back to the Abhidharma text and wrote down a few points. So one is, I made a general, I've already said this. Intelligence can be beneficial or it can be harmful. And then the Abhidharma says there is, he says, there, if we call it the, in our translation, he used wisdom. So he says there can be correct or incorrect wisdom. So that's why I would call it intelligence. There can be correct intelligence or incorrect intelligence. And then he says, and then he makes a point. He says, correct intelligence or correct wisdom depends upon study, contemplating, and meditating. And he says, so if you study, contemplate, and meditate on the wrong things, then you won't develop effective or helpful intelligence. If you study, contemplate, and meditate on the correct things, then you will develop a helpful intelligence. And then there was one more quote I thought was interesting. He says, when intelligence is applied to worldly affairs, that is a quote, it is neither correctly generated nor incorrectly generated. Whereas what they sort of point about is like, it's actually kind of funny because like, what they're saying is intelligence regarding worldly affairs doesn't really matter. It's kind of what is one set. It's not terribly important is from a practice perspective, is what they're saying there. So anyway, what they're saying is cultivate, the advice essentially that Tsongkhapa is giving, right, is cultivate actual wisdom with regards to the matters worthy of your contemplation, right? And he's actually implying something, which is, again, like you have a precious human rebirth, which is rare and difficult to find again and impermanent. And so use it, what's the word, to analyze what's worth your intelligence, right? What's worth your time, what's worth your brilliance. Because compared to, we have, like, animals have wisdom, their intelligence, this quality of sharab. Animals have that too, but you're a human, you have it much more than an animal. So use it well to analyze what's worthy of being analyzed, and then you can progress on the path. Actually, I'll pause there. Any questions about that? You guys have asked some good questions, but any more questions about wisdom? Because then he makes some general points. Lynn.
This whole idea of eradicating doubt rubs me the wrong way because it makes me feel like, my opinion, okay, is that's part of the problem we have with all the world religions, that they're fanatics and they know they've eradicated doubt. They're the chosen ones. They're the ones that are right. And I just think that, maybe I should say, I feel that if you eradicate doubt, you don't let a lot of information in that is good information to make good choices. So it's this issue of eradicating doubt as you go about trying to do the best you can in the world and live an ethical life. I mean, I just don't see that as a good thing.
Interesting. To say, like, on the one hand, I get your point, and sometimes there are contexts in which I would say the same thing, but answering from this perspective, from the perspective that's being suggested here, I think I'll give an example of what they're getting at. I'm not going to go to emptiness, because I think that's more subtle than is probably useful for this topic, for what we're talking about. But what they're getting at, actually, I think, is like, if a person analyzes their own experience, right, based on your own experience and if you come to a conclusion, like, for example, if you were to come to an absolute clarity, every time I've seen someone, myself or somebody else, be hateful, it causes suffering. Hatred is the cause of suffering. I will do all I can to eradicate hatred from my being. I have no doubt that that's what I want to do with my life. That's what they're getting at here, right? Like, so through analyzing, through the 4 types of reasoning, if you come to an absolute clarity that the subjective inner experience of hatred is destructive, and then you decide to do all you can to eradicate hatred from yourself, and then you say, I have no doubt that that's one of my goals in life. That's the kind of state they're talking about here. You know, or actually, I remember once, I'll share one of my own experience. Like there was one day I was sort of contemplating Buddhist teachings. I had this thought, I was like, I was differentiating, like, I was like, oh, wow, people differentiate love. Like, what does love mean? You know, and differentiate love from attachment, but also love from kind of manipulation, love from, there are all kinds of things that appear like love, but aren't love, you know, that people do, right? That people think they're being loving, but they're really trying to manipulate, or they think they're being loving, but they're trying to get people to like them, or they think they're being loving, but they're really trying to convince themselves that they're a good person. Whatever, you know, there are all kinds of things that that people take for love that aren't love. I remember I was kind of contemplating that one day, and then I was like, oh, whereas this is actual love. And then I came to a kind of clarity. I was like, that's good, no matter what. Like that actual love, like these other things, I don't know if they're good or bad. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. I don't know about those. I'm not sure. But this thing that's actual love, that's good. No matter what, that's a good thing. Even if somebody does the wrong thing out of that, I still, like, I can think of examples in my life where somebody was actually being loving and, you know, the other person wasn't open to whatever. And I was like, I still think that was the most beautiful thing that could have been, like, it was an absolutely beautiful thing, even though, you know, when my grandmother tried to be loving to my uncle, so one day he didn't notice and whatever, he wasn't going to stop or whatever he was doing. I was like, it was still beautiful that she was loving. I don't care. Like, that was absolutely gorgeous, you know, from my perspective. And I came to, like, I had no doubt in my mind that was my experience, and that was what I had seen throughout, you know, through reasoning and through experience. So they're getting at those kinds of inner clarities about something that are the same as, like, knowing that, you know, when water, you know, that if you have water in space, it's going to, on this planet, it's going to go down. Like, that's the reasoning, the reasoning of nature, right? Like, you know, as you know, that if it's frozen, that's different. But if water's in its liquid state, it's going to go towards the planet, not away from it. There's a kind of, so it's like an overcoming doubt about, oh, that's how that works. You know, and whatever it would be, my examples of hatred or love or water going down, or but and actually, I guess, and part of what this is getting at, I think, Lynn, to get at your point, though, is actually, this is why I'll just share one more reflection, which I think this is part of the benefit of debate in Buddhism, is, yeah, actually, I've given this example before, but, like, and your point about religion also with that, I've often noted, like, actually, one of the things I really appreciate about some of the Gelugpa monks I know is they'll point out, like, you're not certain, actually. You know, like, in other words, you have to, like, so I've seen so many examples of this over the years, but, like, you know, where I've, like, sat with friends and a geshe will start to debate, and they'll debate against Buddhist view. You know, like, so they'll uphold the position that disagrees with Buddhism, and they'll say, well, if you believe that Buddhism's correct, you should be able to win this debate. You know, and then if you can't, they'll say you don't have this. Then you still have doubts. You don't really. They'll actually point out, you think you don't have doubts, but you have doubts. And if you can't come to a clarity, you know, like, if you can't come to a clarity through actual reasoning, then it's just a belief, actually. It's not a wisdom. in this sense. And so I think part of what you're getting at too is that we, all of us, I mean, so people from every religion, including Buddhism, sometimes aren't good at differentiating our beliefs from what we know. And what this is getting at is a knowing, right? And like, and so I just think that's an important point. You know, so have you really come to a clarity that's, what's there to say, right? That strongly differentiates the qualities of things to be examined, which actually then overcomes doubt? Or are you just convincing yourself you don't have doubts because it's comfortable, or because it's reinforces your sense of yourself or of the world, that you want to think the world is a certain way? And what Buddhism is suggesting is that's not this. So I think we have to also differentiate that. And I think, yeah, I've heard so many, actually, I'll just share that. I'm just thinking back. I've heard also so many different, like people monks I've known, who will say some of their favorite moments were when they thought they believed something. They're Buddhist monks who say one of their favorite moments in their lives was they thought they believed something, or they thought they knew something. And then they realized they didn't know it. That they were wrong in their assertion that they knew that thing. You know, and it's getting at this, that in other words, that to like unearth your doubts in order to then analyze them. And to say, do I really know that, is part of what Buddhism is suggesting we should do. And that oftentimes we like foreclose the process before we've unearthed our own doubts.
Mm.
And yeah, and that's problematic, actually, because one way I sometimes think of it is like, does every part of you believe it? Does every part of you know it? You know, is one way I would ask that question of myself, to be honest. Is like, because there are things I believe that I'm like, well, there are parts of me that don't believe it though.
Hmm.
And why? You know, and what do they believe and why? And like, this is getting at like when Tsongkhapa says, right, examine day and night, right, the meaning of what you've heard with the 4 types of reasoning, and eradicate doubt, right, by contemplating the objects that are to be contemplated. I think that's what he's getting at personally, is like, ask over and over again, right, day and night, right? So even in your dreams, ask, what do I really believe? Why do I believe it? Is this certain? You know, am I actually applying all 4 types of reasoning to that? Does any type of reasoning contradict that? That's what Tsongkhapa is suggesting we should do, right? Is there anything that would contradict this? You know, can I think of a counterexample? You know, and there was one of the examples I mean, there are many examples. I remember I told this story before, but one time, Ken Rinpoche at my old house was teaching, and he started debating with me and Wilson Hurley, our friend of mine, saying, you know, there's a core Buddhist teaching, right, that well-being and happiness come from cherishing others, right, and suffering comes from self-centered attitude. And Ken Rinpoche started arguing that's wrong. Of course, he believes it's right. You know, he taught that before. He said that's wrong, and he was arguing why that's wrong. And he was, you know, of course, we were losing the debate, and it was like quite embarrassing. You know, like you couldn't even uphold that most basic of Buddhist tenets. Really, like, how do you know? He was basically what he was saying. How do you know that's true? Here's a counterexample. Why is that not a counterexample? You know, and my point just is like, that's what, at least that's the approach that that Buddhism is suggesting we take, is keep asking. And so, and you know, and if you know something, you should know, if you really know something, you should know it the way you know, like I know that fire burns up a piece of paper. I don't have any doubt about that. Like, in other words, if I set fire to a piece of dry paper, you know, the piece of paper doesn't remain after it's burned. It's ash, right? I know that because I've tried it many times and whatever, you know, like there's a sense of like, you know, what they're getting at is like, one should ask it until one knows something in a definitive way, or else one should know that I don't know it in a definitive way. Anyway, that's. Oh, Sujata.
This class has been wildly beneficial to me personally, so I just really want to thank you. And I think one of the things I'm thinking about in this, well, with Lynn's question is the word humility comes to mind, about like somehow it seems that those teachers who have the most certainty are actually the most humble. And I've been thinking about like, you know, Kemso Rinpoche or like His Holiness, like they're certain about a lot of things that I am not yet certain of. And they are so much more humble than I am. And that realization has been extremely humbling. So thank you for this question and this opportunity to grapple with that. I think I'm thinking the question that I have is around regret and confusion about things in the past. So like thinking about like a fork in the road in my earlier years, where had I gone a different direction, I might have become a nun. And that really nags at me, even though I'm so glad I have this child and this life and whatever. And I think something started to become more clear in this class around just pausing and analyzing that more, like, okay, that was a fork in the road. What might have happened if it had gone this way? What might have happened if it had gone that way? And sort of realizing the karma was not there, the causes and conditions were not there strong enough for me to have made that choice at that time. And if that does involve the karma to have been separated from a guru or separated from the blessing of having been able to immerse myself fully when I still had such great mental faculties when I was younger and, you know, could have studied more or whatever, you know, to be able to then, there was a certainty that arose in this being like, oh, okay, well then once you have certainty that that's karma, then you can apply antidotes and like, okay, just do some Vajrasattva practice about being separated from the guru. Like it felt like something just got cleared up in that way. And so I think I don't think this is a question anymore. I think I just puzzled it out as I was speaking, like the beauty of not being of two minds about something, to even like, it doesn't have to be regret anymore. It's like, oh, that might've been a really wonderful path, or not being clairvoyant. I don't know if that was the path I was supposed to go on. Like lots of stuff could have gone wrong if I had been a nun that wouldn't have actually been beneficial. But there was something around like, then there's something to do once I have certainty, right? Like if I'm sitting around still feeling like maybe I should have been a nun, then just do some Vajrasattva practice around the obstacles that prevented that and have that wish for a future life, right? So that's, I don't know. I don't think I have my question anymore. Forgive me for puzzling it out, but it was, yeah, it's just not knowing what to do, not being able to be of benefit seems more, you know, it'll arise more when I don't have clarity, when I'm of two minds. So that was really helpful.
Thanks for your comment. I can really. Yeah, and I think I think I've wasted. I'm aware I've wasted too much time on things like that, like staying of two minds about a regret or staying of two minds about something that I'm not doing something. Yeah, I've wasted time on that kind of thing myself. Okay. So now just read a brief. So at the end of this section, this is ending that section, discussion of this category of object. So he just makes a general comment about object ascertaining mental factors because he's covered all five. So he says, what is the reason for calling these five mental factors, aspirations, and so forth, object ascertaining? Since these mental factors hold an object through apprehending the individual features of the object, they are said to individually ascertain objects. I'll read what Geshe Rabten says about the same, this general comment. He says, when the mind is actively engaged in a task, be it wholesome or unwholesome, all these mental factors are constantly at work, giving direction, coherence, and meaning to the train of our thought and behavior. Right. So in other words, that while you're engaged in a certain task, So first of all, these five are not omnipresent, right? They're only present when we're engaged in something. Also, they only apply to mental, right? These are not, some of them is in the definition, right? These are not, these don't apply to sensory consciousness, so they're not omnipresent, right? But when we're actively engaging our mind in something, then these factors are present, right? Like, so if you're concentrating, if you, and so on, you have, you have some aspiration that's causing you to make that effort. Like, so when you're actively doing something, right? These are working together. These are aspects of your mind that are working together to bring coherence to your effort, right? To kind of keep that effort or keep that engagement with whatever you're doing going for that period of time. And they work together at those times, but they're not always there because, for example, these are not there when you're sleeping, for example, most of the time. These are not there when you're just, if you were just laying there sort of letting your mind drift, then you're not having, the intelligence is not engaged, the concentration is not engaged. So if you're just sort of laying back in a hammock, looking at, letting your mind drift and kind of your eyes are kind of there, the five omnipresent ones would be present, but these five would not. These five are present when you're actively engaged in, with an object. So they're object ascertaining in that sense, right? They are analyzing, they're engaging, they're bringing a kind of, I like Geshe Rabin's coherence and meaning to your train of thought. Okay, so that's the five object ascertaining. Next section are the 11 virtuous mental factors, and these 11 come from the Abhidharma. So these are 11 virtuous mental factors. So we'll just read the list. The 11 virtuous mental factors are faith. We're gonna have to, we'll work on the language around these because it's interesting. Again, I think there are different implications. All of these do actually, but the way this translates them are faith, shame, embarrassment, non-attachment, non-hatred, non-ignorance, effort, pliancy, conscientiousness, equanimity, and non-harmfulness. We'll go over what those mean because I think it can be confusing. The English words have sometimes connotations and they're sometimes different than maybe what. But anyway, the translators do their best to find an English word that roughly correlates. One point I want to make is these 11 listed virtuous mental factors are not the only virtuous mental factors, obviously, right? There aren't just 11. And I'm sure all of you could think of examples of mental factors that aren't directly mentioned here, right? Like, so that's one point I wanted to make is this list of 11 is not all inclusive of virtuous mental factors. But these are 11 that Abhidharma teaches because they're useful to understand and they help us kind of orient ourselves towards our mind. Another point I want to make is when any of these 11 or when any virtuous mental factor actually is present, then the mind becomes virtuous. Right? These are virtuous mental factors. So if these are present in a given moment in your mind, then your mind is a virtuous mind. And that means that your omnipresent mental factors in that moment are virtuous, that your object ascertaining mental factors in that moment are virtuous, and so on. And that these are the source, these virtuous mental factors are the source of good karma. They are they block the non-virtue, the mental afflictions from arising. So they serve as antidotes to those. And virtuous mental factors can be increased. So in other words, and they're to be increased. That part of Dharma practice is increasing your virtuous mental factors. So it's recognizing what they are, and it's increasing them is part of Dharma practice. And as you increase them, they serve as antidotes to or decrease your mental afflictions. And they also serve as a basis for creating positive karma. Yeah. Those are just a few general points about these virtuous mental factors. And then let's go ahead and just start on the first one, faith. And one point I want to make is I think it's often this one's often translated as faith. I think our translation is faith. I think Geshe Rabin's translator translated as confidence. which I think is an interesting choice. So I would suggest, you can consider that. Do we mean faith? Do we mean confidence? And again, I just think with a lot of these words, it's good to look at the definition and then ask for yourself what captures it. Because actually, it's funny for me, like I don't know, when I hear the word faith, I think of religion myself. I think of various religions, I suppose. But anyway, you can look at the definition, and we'll see what we think, what you think is best. So here's, and I'm going to read a few different descriptions of the definition, but so the Abhidharma, the Compendium of Knowledge, says, what is faith? It is a conviction, clarity, and wishing with respect to an existent that is endowed with excellent qualities and power. It has the function of acting as a support for aspiration. So they're saying faith is conviction, clarity, and wishing, and then it's with respect to an existent that is endowed with and that existent is endowed with excellent qualities and power. Okay, so that's I'll read a different definition. Geshe-Rabtin's definition describes it as a mental factor that focuses on an existent virtuous object, which produces a joyous state of mind free from the turmoil of the root or proximate mental afflictions. It has the function of acting as a basis for aspiring to develop wholesome qualities not yet generated and aspiring to increase those one has already generated. It's a bit of a different definition, but it gets at the same idea, right? Both point out it has to be aimed at something that exists. It has to be aimed at something positive with excellent qualities and power, or that's Geshe-Rabtin, though, adds this idea of it's a joyous state of mind, free from the mental afflictions, right? And then it has a function of, and they both say it includes, it has a function of acting as support for aspiration. So he clarifies aspiration for increasing one's good qualities. And Art's translation says, faith is a belief, clarity of mind, or aspiration towards karma and its results, the Four Noble Truths, or the Three Jewels. That's from his translation from Vasubandhu. So these are different authors' definitions of this, but they all get at certain similar points. One point is it has to be directed at, faith must be in an existent thing. So you can't have faith in something that doesn't exist, is one point, according to this definition. And they're getting at like where the one translator says conviction, Art says a belief, right? They both say clarity. And then this translation says wishing, whereas Art says aspiration, right? But so it has those qualities. We're going to get into those three, but and so also faith acts as support for aspiring to something. It's an interesting point. So it says, just as has been, now Geshe Gelsen expands on the definition. It says, just as has been said above, faith is a knower that has an aspect of conviction, clarity, or wishing, and it serves as a direct antidote for non-faith. When divided, faith is of three types. And then he lists the three types. One point I want to make before we get into the three types is that these three types can exist according to, in general. You can have one of them, or you can have more than one simultaneously. So in other words, you can have just one of these three types of faith, or you can have two, or you can have all three. It's possible. They can coexist. And then he lists this translator translates them as clarifying faith, faith of conviction, and wishing faith. There's time, so you can keep going. So the first one, clarifying faith. Another translator translates this one as admiring faith. So first I'll read this definition. Clarifying faith is a clear mind engendered by seeing the excellent qualities of those so endowed, such as the three jewels. Why is it called clarifying? For example, when one places the water purifying gem in dirty water, the murkiness of the water is immediately cleared away. Similarly, when this faith is generated, the murkiness of the mind is cleared away, whereupon all excellent qualities of realization become suitable to arise in one's continuum. So actually, I want to say this idea of clarifying, they're talking about a kind of a mythical gem that clarifies the mind, but you could say it's almost like oh wow, what is this called? Like I mean, actually, if you were going to say the same idea, it would be like we call those water purifiers, right? Like if you put, like they're like you call them like filtration systems, right? Like so, if you have water that has a lot of dirt in it or murkiness in it, and you put it through a good filtration system, then it becomes very clear. So they're saying this kind of faith is like that for the mind. It clarifies your mind. It sort of gets rid of murkiness in that sense. And it's focused, one of the translators said admiring, because it's focused on seeing the excellent qualities of the three jewels or some other virtuous object and appreciating them or admiring them. Geshe Rabton, I'm going to read a little bit of his description of this one. He says, it opposes turbidity of mind. So it blocks the turbid mental afflictions from arising and causes the mind to become clear and bright. It is joyous and delighted. Its action is to serve as a support for aspiration. So it takes delight on what it's focused on and holds it dear. Those were, I pieced those together from different parts of what he'd said. So, so this mind, right, this particular version of faith, right, it could be in the three jewels. It could also be, actually, if you've, you may have had an experience of, some of you, I suspect, I'm not sure if everybody, but I'm sure, I suspect some of you have had this experience. If you're with like a great lama, like a great spiritual teacher or something, sometimes you may have this experience of like, where your mind feels very clear and you have a kind of joy or happiness. You have a kind of actually, I'll share a personal story just briefly. I remember there was I never, these days it's been a few years since I've even seen Lama Zopa Rinpoche, but there was a time when I used to see Lama Zopa Rinpoche with some regularity, and I realized after a while, like, I needed to be very careful, because when I was around Lama Zopa Rinpoche, my mind would change. I would be like joyous and energetic, and I would sort of start doing things, and it wouldn't occur to me that that was because of being around him, and that when he left, I would suddenly be exhausted. That kept happening, where I would be around him and I would do all these things and take on things, and then he would leave and I would be like collapse in exhaustion, because I wasn't realizing that I was like feeling so positive. I had a lot of faith of this kind, but it wasn't occurring to me. It wasn't through my power. It was through the mind of faith and his, good qualities, and there was something about his presence. But then I kept getting totally exhausted. So then I started going, okay, even when Rinpoche's here, still sleep and still like don't do more than you can do, because you're not like him. So I had to remind myself of that. I would get confused by the faith, the power of the faith. But anyway, so faith can be like, it can also be in your teacher, is my point, right? Or it can be in the three jewels or whatever, or deity or whatever. But the point here is that it's a mind. That's why I like this idea of admiring. So it's a mind that sees that, that it's a mind that sees or ascertains the good qualities of what you're focusing on, right? Could be of the Dharma also, it could be of the Sangha. But it sees those good qualities, it takes a kind of delight or joy in those good qualities. And and therefore it temporarily causes negative states of mind, like jealousy or so on, or pride or anger or whatever, to be temporarily sort of that turbidity, or the, you know what I say, the like a water filtration. It doesn't permanently get rid of them, but temporarily they kind of settle out of your mind. They're not present, they're not active. They're still there as a potential, but they're not active at that time. Because your mind is engaged with some, some virtuous object of awareness, with a sense of what's the word? Admiration, joy, delight, and then it serves as support for aspiration, right? Means that because you're appreciating those good qualities, those wonderful traits, those marvelous things in the object of faith, based upon such faith, you can then aspire to develop those qualities, right? And part of the point I want to make with this one is that's part of the benefit of faith, right? Is like, through having faith in an object like a teacher or the three jewels or something, you can also develop a kind of aspiration to have similar qualities. In other words, you can recognize it's possible to develop such qualities in yourself. So that's another benefit of faith, is that you can then you can aspire to have those qualities. And part of what they're getting at there, just want to point this out, is if you don't actually, I mean, oh my goodness, it's funny, isn't it? Like, I'm going to say this the right way, like, if you haven't come across the possibility of developing certain qualities, then you won't think it's possible, right? Like, that's part of the benefit of meeting people who are more advanced along the path than us, is that we can see it's possible, or we can develop faith rather that it's possible, right? So it serves, so like, by seeing the qualities of the three jewels, you can aspire to realize some of the points of the Dharma, for example, right? So you get the idea of this mind, right? Like, through the sense of delight and appreciation or admiration, it settles down the turbidity of mind, it settles down your mental afflictions. You have this kind of admiration for those qualities that you see. And from that appreciation or admiration, or whatever you want to call it, can come a sense of aspiration. So that's why in the last line here, whereupon all excellent qualities of realization become suitable to arise in one's continuum, right? So they become, partly because your mental afflictions are decreased, and partly, or temporarily suppressed, or temporarily settled down, you could say, and partly because it serves as a basis for aspiration. It's a what's there to say, right? Good qualities can arise from faith in that sense, right? Because you can see those good qualities and appreciate them or admire them, and therefore you can aspire to them. So that's the first of the three kinds of faith. At one point, maybe there's still a couple minutes. I'm just do the second kind. The faith of conviction is the gaining of conviction through contemplating the modes of dependent rising, cause and result, and so forth, that are taught by the conqueror, meaning the Buddha. So this one comes about through study and contemplation, that you develop a kind of conviction, or in a certain topic. So it's a kind of faith that comes about through reasoning, right? And part of the reason I want to differentiate those is I want to say the first one doesn't have to be through reason, right? Like in my example, it was kind of a not very well reasoned, in other words, when I was just sort of energized because I was around Lama Zopa Rinpoche, that wasn't a very deeply reasoned faith at that time. It was just kind of like, wow, like he's amazing. And I was appreciating his good qualities, but I wasn't, in some of those examples, I wasn't like reasoning through it. Also, like that first kind of faith, there are many Buddhist stories, right? Like there are many Buddhist stories throughout history, and still to this time, but right, of people who do, like the Buddha himself did, or Padmasambhava, or different teachers who like did miracles, right? The first one can come about through that, like they say, oh, they saw such and such Buddhist yogi or yogini put their foot into a rock and left a footprint, right, in solid stone or something. And a person could develop an extreme clarifying faith based on that, right? Oh, wow, that's amazing. Or, the Buddha floated up in the air and people felt some kind of faith. Oh, or Milarepa flew, right? They say Milarepa flew around without an airplane. And then people develop some kind of faith. Oh, wow. Then actually somebody didn't. So there was one person who wanted to shoot him down with a bow and arrow or something. I remember one story. So not everybody developed faith. Some people thought, oh, he's like, which actually is what, it's true, isn't it? He's different, so let's kill him or something. Anyway, funny, but sometimes, like this kind of faith can come about through just like somebody's energy or somebody's remarkable activity, the first one. The second one has to be based on reasoning. So it's a different kind of faith, right? It has to be based on a sense of conviction through contemplating a teaching, right? Using wisdom, really. So these two are different in that sense, right? And according to Buddhism, the second kind of faith is better than the first, right? It's better to have, it's like actually these kind of ideally you can have all three or you can have any one of them, and they're all virtuous. But there's an emphasis on the second over the first. And also oftentimes they go in order. Sometimes people can develop a kind of naive faith, but then you should apply reasoning to check up, is that faith based in, because the idea is that the first kind of faith in and of itself can be fickle also, right? Because it's not well thought through and it's not, if it's, anyway, it's not well analyzed. And so it can also be flimsier. Whereas the second kind that comes about through gaining conviction through contemplation is more firm. So it's encouraged to develop the second kind of faith. And we're just almost out of time. So we'll stop there and we'll pick up the third kind of faith. I'll review those two briefly and then pick up with the third kind of faith next time. We'll continue on from there. But also I just want to ask you just to contemplate, like, I don't know, yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, what word do these get? I don't know, is that faith? I guess it's a question of, like, maybe, I don't know. Is it conviction? Is it confidence? Is it trust? There are different words you could use in English to get at these. And I'm not sure, I don't know if any of them gets it perfectly, but is it faith? Is it conviction? Is it trust? Is it, but hopefully you're getting a sense of what Buddhists mean by this, or what this term means in the context of Buddhism, and that's what matters in this, because that's what we're studying. But anyway, it's 12:30, so we should stop. So let's do the dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side. So the I, who is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side. In order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate it so much.
Oh, thanks. Good.
Thank you, Lauren.
We'll see you all next time.